So, welcome back. We're now on our next panel, which is the Global Inequality Crisis, Digital Divides, Information Dominance, and Democratic Deficits. And thank you, New York City, for the background noise. I'm delighted to chair this panel and to introduce our panelists. So, in reverse order, depending on the way you're looking, but let's start from my left here. So, Ramesh Srinivasan, pronounced perfectly, I guess. No background in Sri Lanka on my end, but you know, who was, as you know, professor at UCLA, author of Beyond the Valley, and I'm sure plenty of other good stuff coming, hopefully as a result of his participation today. We have Blair Levin, who was the national director of the first broadband plan, I believe, in the United States, but Blair will tell us more about that. And Andrea Correa, am I pronouncing that right? Who's a political scientist and author of a very fascinating book he'll mention briefly on the smart city side here at Columbia. So I just want to give you a little bit of context on the panel, what we're looking to cover from this for the global audience. This, again, is being live streamed globally, all on the record, so please speak freely, and your words will be crystallized in history forever. But that's a good thing, and I'm sure you can stand behind what you have to say today. So the essence of this panel is, in essence, the word inequality, which is the global inequality crisis, around particularly digital divides, and how this is impacting, if you like, the information ecosystem, and then democracy and its viability and integrity in general. And very much this is a question on one side of access, so who is part of this digital revolution that we're still undergoing, and who isn't, and why not, and what can be done to fix that, if anything, whether that be on the city level, the national level, the more global level, and how this then actually impacts our participation as citizens in democracy, institutions, elections, etc. And obviously this is very topical, given that we're moving into an election year here in the US next year, and how this impacts. And a little bit of history here. We had in the last panel a very prominent historian, but I'm very intrigued to get the perspectives as to where we were, where we are, and where we're going, and whether we are actually making progress, or whether, in a sense, we're in a bit of a period of stagnation. And I get the sense that there is a sort of stagnation happening to some extent here, and a very complicated picture, and we're talking primarily here in the US, but we would also like to get the global flavor here. But I will let each of you start with perspectives, and I think Blair, having been the director of the Broadband plan, which one assumes was to create broadband access to the whole nation and then ensure that everyone had fair and equal access, that you'd be a great place to start on this in terms of digital divides within the US, and then what you see more globally, but particularly within the US, what was achieved and where we are and where we're going and where we need to be.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm going to reference kind of three different experiences. One was being chief of staff at the FCC when the internet rose up in the early 90s. The second is during the National Broadband Plan in 2010. And then last year I worked on a project with UN and the World Bank, basically doing what was the equivalent of a national broadband plan for refugees. And the reason I say that is, so the U.S. was about the 35th country to do a national broadband plan, and now about 156 countries have done it. Fundamentally, they all try to resolve three questions: how do you get networks everywhere, how do you get everybody on them, and how do you utilize them to better deliver public goods and services. Most people think it's only the first, which is how do you get networks everywhere, and really that's how do you get networks everywhere to kind of rural areas where the traditional market economics don't work. What I would say is, from the perspective of the early 90s, we thought the internet would be totally fantastic in closing lots of gaps, because if you eliminate the distribution cost of information, theoretically you should improve education, healthcare, public safety, all kinds of public goods. That hasn't happened. And the reason, I think, is we have way over-indexed for the first problem of access. A problem which is soon to be solved, in my opinion, particularly in the United States, within the next 5 years, and yet nonetheless you have very progressive Democratic candidates for president saying we need to spend an extra $60 billion, $80 billion, $85 billion, and Bernie Sanders, of course, had the most, $160 billion, to solve the problem of access to rural America, where what I'm seeing is certain technologies that are solving that. The second problem, adoption, it's an interesting question of whether it's really about affordability or it's about digital literacy or it's about relevance. But we're spending much, much less money trying to solve it, and yet it's a problem which is 4 times larger. But the third is really the important thing, and this was really striking to me when I was doing the thing with the refugees, which is we have developed all kinds of ways of delivering public goods and services, which, frankly, we have to be on an analog platform until everybody is on the digital platform, but that makes it very inefficient in terms of how we deliver certain goods and services. And when you look at the humanitarian sector and the financial resources, we are not making the kinds of systemic institutional changes we need to make to really deliver those goods more effectively. And then finally, I'll just say, in the case of refugees, but it's really interesting because I think it goes to both humanitarian and economic development issues on a global perspective. There are other ways in which, if you're not on, you don't have access to all kinds of things. In Africa now, we're actually moving toward digital money much faster than we're doing it in the United States. But if you're a climate refugee or a political refugee, and you don't have certain identification papers, which a lot of refugees don't, you can't have access to digital money by virtue of law. So there's a kind of a fourth barrier in terms of legal access that in about half the world we have to address as well. But the point is, we have been over-indexing for some of the barriers and under-investing in others.
Got it. Ramesh, if you want to give your perspectives on those key questions I laid out.
Yeah, absolutely. So outside of the AI space, which I just spoke at, the reason that you got me back to back is because a lot of my work historically and in an ongoing way as well has been to explore the internet's relationship to diverse communities across the world, across the global south and across the developing world, and even with Native American communities, for example, here in the United States, who face many infrastructural and not just access, great point on that, not just access-oriented challenges here in the United States. What we find more or less, and there's some empirical studies on this, Esther Hargitay at Northwestern has done some work on this. The renowned Saskia Sassen here at Columbia has done work in this space as well, is that more or less on a naive level, access itself is not actually, it does not necessarily mean closing inequality gaps, right? Because the question is who monetizes that access, or even what does that access open up in terms of one's developmental pathway, right? So for example, if I have, so there were some controlled studies that were done looking at access more or less to different communities that had different sort of levels on the economic spectrum in Germany. And so a very quick analysis of this showed that even if you kind of controlled for the economic level, sort of and everything else was sort of the same, I mean, sort of ability to use a computer, same infrastructure and so on, the person who was less wealthy would actually benefit much less than the person who was more wealthy. The reason why is the resources someone already had before they came to the digital table, so to speak, would actually allow them to use that connectivity, use that access in ways that disproportionately benefited themselves, more so than the person who was poorer. So for example, if I had access but no money, I wouldn't necessarily be able to use that access to get money in the stock exchange, right? I might actually use that access to engage in things like entertainment and so on. So these are actually just outcomes from this study. So what we see more or less occurring across the world is again and again and again, the point in my new book, Beyond the Valley, is really about governance, right? So that there are examples across the world where we see 3+ billion users, for example, of Google products, similar number of Facebook products, but the false positives are very dramatic, right? Because the governance of those platforms is here, or at least in Silicon Valley, but the issues that occur in relation to people and their own communities and environments are much more staggering because of the disconnection between those building the connectivity, if you will, to the technology platform and the real-life experiences of people in those parts of the world. That's why you see examples of technologies, WhatsApp, for example, creating misinformation issues, or the Rohingya community in Myanmar, being misidentified as the terrorist group when they were the ones having the genocide committed against them, or Sri Lankan issues. I can give you tons of examples of this. So the point I'm getting at here is these technologies can be incredibly empowering in all sorts of manners for different communities in different parts of the world. But it's not simply about accessing some technology, because access can be more different than it is similar. Accessing Facebook in one part of the world versus another may be a very different experience than being able to access a crop application that's really designed and monetized by a local community. So there are lots of different ways we can introduce, again, those issues of governance into the technology access problem. We can think about infrastructures, for example, like ISPs and cell phone networks that might be governed or even owned or designed by local communities. A chapter in my new book tells the story of the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world, run by a bunch of indigenous communities in Oaxaca, in southern Mexico. And what's so interesting about that project is those communities were not provided cell phone or internet access. And they said, hey, we don't have this access, but we want it for our own reasons, for our own terms. We want to sell products at fair prices. We want to connect to our relatives who are in cities. We want to connect to our relatives who are in Los Angeles, in the United States. So what they did is they built it themselves, they own it themselves, and they're monetizing the externalities of that network, right? And so the point I want to make is that infrastructures, even platforms themselves, the question of who governs them and owns them and localizes them is something that all of us can take power over. So that's my sort of power to the people side of this new book.
Excellent. Andre?
Yeah, thank you.
Bit of background on yourself as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for mentioning the Smarter New York City book. I'll make it less, more organic references to the book in a little bit. So I focus my work mostly on understanding innovation from within public structures. I mean, how do municipalities build their innovation agendas? How city agencies build their innovation agendas in an effort to build narratives around the capacity of innovation, the capacity of public structures to innovate, which is a sort of narrative that it's not obvious for the common citizen and even for very large areas of the scientific landscape. And I want to tell a story that helps connect multiple dots here. 2 years ago, I was in the Smart City Conference, and I emphasize Smart City Conference. And there's a reason why the book is called Smarter and not Smart New York City. I'm in a conference 2 years ago in Santa Clara, California, in the San Francisco Valley Bay Area. And during lunchtime, as I'm approaching one of the tables to place my plate, and two gentlemen representing two mid-sized towns in the Midwest, as they see me approach the table, and I had my Columbia University badge, they simultaneously, they react as I approach, we're not smart yet. So these are two representatives of the names of the cities don't matter now. Two representatives of cities in a conference about smart cities that are incredibly embarrassed to engage in a conversation about innovation. And I wonder, why is this happening? These guys should be in the forefront of the conversation and advocating for their cities. Well, my understanding is that innovation narratives, innovation stories, innovation agendas mostly built around tech and data is not helping 99% of the cities around the world that are basically technically bankrupt. So the question that I raise in my book, and by the way, I brought on board 26 colleagues from 10 different universities citywide, is to understand how can we bring these cities into the web? How can we help these cities build incrementally? I really like one of the ideas mentioned in the previous panel. One of your guests mentioned the idea that we need to break down the problem in very small and simple parcels and then help stakeholders believe and develop as they go. So my first comment to this initial conversation is that we need to help city agencies and city administrations in less resourced countries, and clearly I'm not talking about London and New York and Paris and Tokyo and Stockholms of the world. I'm talking about cities where, by the way, the most pressing urban issues exist, and how can we bring them into this discussion?
Okay, interesting. Blair, any sort of follow-up to those points in relation to two different perspectives, global, well, both global actually. So,
well, just a very quick thing. After I did the National Broadband Plan, I started working in cities because one of the things that when you look at the three fundamental problems of access, adoption, and utilization, the bigger problems, in my opinion, were adoption and utilization. And in most countries, certainly in the United States, most of the activity is done at the municipal level.
yeah.
And so that's really where the solution set resides, whether we're doing it in a smarter or less smart way. That's, but the federal government, which is fundamentally dysfunctional anyway, is particularly dysfunctional with those two.
But
elements.
but that's precisely the point, is that these innovation processes are happening at local level, but we don't understand them well. Yeah. So one of the goals of the book, and the reason why it's called Smarter, is to point to this idea of learning as we go, instead of this idealistic science fiction future that nobody really knows what it means, and is creating these fears of adoption across the board.
Ramesh, you're about to add
no,
something.
these issues happen at different levels of scale. Without question, the level of thinking about access, but really incentivizing bottom-up innovation on the local level is really the key. I completely agree with you. And so that can occur. So in Beyond the Valley, I give these examples of us, if you will, entrepreneurs or even social entrepreneurs, or at times even activists, right? Taking technologies, taking connectivity, and just kind of modifying it, remediating it, localizing it, creating value for their own local ecosystem based on the realities of their own environment within which they live. I'll give you just two quick examples. One is I have a short chapter in the book all about a group that is using solar-powered Wi-Fi routers to bypass problems with the GSM network and building LTE connectivity into local communities. But it's not just about access to the connectivity, it's actually trying to understand how the environmental aspect of it, but also who can be employed, how that can build businesses, and what types of connectivity are meaningful for what people in what communities, right? So they've actually embedded this Wi-Fi connectivity. They were the founders of a group called Ushahidi, which was sort of a open source crowd mapping platform that started in Nairobi that Obama praised and so on. But they now have built, Wi-Fi routers that are on matatus, which are like moving vehicles, like colectivos in Latin America. So there's an understanding of the local environments. Or another point is, this second point example comes out of the inequalities of the global economy, even the inequalities within our own country. But you see, this whole question of what innovation is also a term that there's a discursive stranglehold over, where we sort of think about it as something that only comes out of Silicon Valley. A whole other way of thinking about innovation is being resourceful, doing more with less, right? And so I tell stories in this book of people, for example, in Kenya. Again, Kenya is just a remarkable country, building 3D printers out of almost completely e-waste. They take things that we think are dead, we throw them away, and they give them new forms of life and build business ecosystems out of that and developmental ecosystems. And actually, in that sense, they're able to create value and actually better functioning and more resilient machines than ones that would be imported from China or the West, because they're designed by entrepreneurs applying digital technologies of all forms to their own environments, right? So that's a whole other model of thinking about locality and globalism,
Let me just sort of shift the discussion slightly to democracy and participation in democracy and how digital divides have affected that. There was talk about 15, 20 years ago, a big push towards e-government, and this National Broadband Plan, I'm sure, was connected to that. And the idea being the aspiration that people who otherwise may not be able to vote were voting online, particularly in rural areas, and there was just generally greater participation. There's an increased urgency to that now, given the political climate, not just here, but globally. How is this, we call this democratic deficits, in essence. How do each of you see this? And, any guide as to where we should be going? Because at the moment, again, we seem to be in a bit of a sort of reactive stagnation period where there isn't a lot of proactive action happening on a global or even local level around this. So how digital divides are impacting democratic deficits, each of you. Blair, I can see you want to feed in on that.
Well, first of all, I would say that there's a tremendous democratic deficit but it's not at all related to technology. In the United States, the single biggest cause of the democracy deficit is the Electoral College. This isn't well known, but if you look at the turnout in states, the swing states, they're roughly speaking 15 to 25% higher because there's a lot more intensive presidential campaigning in those 4 or 5 states. And if you were to project that level of turnout in every state, if you went to a popular vote so that every vote counted equally, you would have the greatest increase in democracy, and you would also solve a bunch of other problems. The second thing, which again, this has nothing to do with technology, though technology is utilized in it, is that there are, in a very large number of states, an actual effort to suppress democracy. That is to say, you look at Ohio, which recently took 40,000 people off the voter rolls. It's not at all clear why. It's just very clear who they took off the voter rolls, which is to say various populations that vote Democratic. But you saw this in Georgia before the last election, the governor's election. You saw it in Florida. You see it in Florida again now. So that has nothing to do with technology. That just has to do with a certain view of democracy, which is it is a game in which the only purpose is to win, as opposed to having a fair process. Having said that, however, part of the problem is with all the discussion of things like hacking, there's a greater concern about trusting electronics to solve our problems. And I think this is a case where it's like what Mark Twain said about the cat who sits on a hot stove doesn't sit on a hot stove ever again, doesn't sit on a cold one either. In other words, we're learning wrong lessons, but that's partly because we have a political culture right now, and this will sound partisan, but since I worked for 2 Democratic administrations, it won't surprise you. You have one party that is fundamentally focused on how do we win, and another party which, in my opinion, is focused on what's a process over time. But it's not really about technology. It's really more about that difference.
Okay. Andre, I don't know if you have anything to add on that level.
Yeah, I would like to enter this conversation from the data democratization standpoint.
Yeah.
And price mechanisms have, for several centuries, being a very useful tool to bring demand and supply together. Well, that same price mechanism is not working for the data markets currently. And no one should question the large amounts of data available, so the supply side. No one should question how large is the demand side, how much different stakeholders, and I always come from the perspective of the public side, would benefit from access to additional data sets. But again, markets, a logic, a structure, a data market based on a price mechanism is not helping, simply because the demand side does not have the resources to purchase the data sets that could be useful. And if we continue to structure data markets around the monetization discourse, we are losing the battle of the public good, because the private side will continue to gain leverage and we continue to be ahead of the public end. So on the positive side, I mean, I think what we need to do, and I've been piloting some projects at New Lab. New Lab is the largest urban tech incubator in New York. They are housed at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and we've been testing and piloting incentive systems and governance structures that can bring startups together with city agencies to address common issues, common problems, specifically with working on mobility, resilience, waste collection, and economic development. So the challenge here, how can we evolve mentally and back to your idea of trust and reciprocity, to build data markets that allow this demand and supply of data to match in much more in a much smarter way. If we don't,
but coming back to the democracy question though, and democratic deficits, how does that impact?
Well, if data is the oil of the 21st century, sure, one would argue that we should aim at having oil for all. Yeah. So the point is, if we remain on the data monetization discourse and we remain on price mechanisms, market arrangements, we will be further emphasizing and bridging the democratic deficit.
Okay.
So for me, almost every election, both in our country and increasingly around the world, is partly a story of what the internet looks like at that time and social media looks like, right? I mean, I don't need to remind anybody in the room of how in 2016, the largest media company in the history of the world, though it doesn't call itself a media company, is Facebook, right? So like how Facebook became the place where people received their news, they received their information. It's not unique to Facebook. We do that through other we do that through Google and Twitter and so on as well. However, the issue of these platforms potentially being optimized for disorientation, the spectacle, which can maintain our attention, which then transacts into data, right? Because the more we're on there, the more we give up data. So that's one manifestation of technology that can be absolutely destructive to a democracy, because I could be sitting right next to both of you, and Darren and I could both consider ourselves liberal or whatever, and we might have similar political views, but we could be opened up to a completely different environmental and even news, and as we found out, fake news landscape as well. So that's one manifestation of the internet. Divide, conquer, use digital footprints to behaviorally modify and potentially civically threaten democracies. But another manifestation of the internet, which is also still very much happening in the context of democracies, is the crowdsourcing model, right? Which is a term we don't use very often anymore. But basically, and that's why I refer to Ushahidi as an example, it's like bring people together. You know, I may not have much money, but I can give $18 to this campaign, or I can give $27 to that campaign. It's a whole way of circumventing through a public deployment of crowd-based technologies, a model that is not about sort of 24/7 surveillance and manipulation. So that's another side of this as well. So the internet looks like lots of things because the internet is everything and is in everything, and it's obviously a fundamental language by which democracies are expressed or circumvented and blocked.
So back to the concept of digital divides. Are these worsening? Are we in a situation where the gap is going to become bigger and bigger between those emboldened with, if you like, digital rights, digital capabilities, and those who don't have? Because that's what it looks like. And we looks like we're entering a very sort of divided, stratified period here. And that divide is then going to express itself in different participation in the consumer economy, in democracy, in elections. Blair, what's your take on that?
It's going to get worse.
And why is that? And can anything be done to reverse the role?
Yeah. And there's a simple reason for it. In the era of the first networks, which was the telephone network, there was a fundamental deal, and this was true across the world, universal service in exchange for a monopoly. Yep. This also was the basic deal for cable, though it was done at the city level, not the national level. What we're doing now is we're building out networks, and we'll really see this with 5G, where we are, and by the way, the policy makes sense. There is no monopoly to give out anymore, and so what you have is classic cream skimming, where people are building in networks, in certain parts of North Carolina, in the Research Triangle Park and in Charlotte. You have Google Fiber, you're going to have the traditional telco, you've got the cable company, so you've got 3 gigabit networks. They're going to get 5G networks in there, and that will both have an access component in terms of higher bandwidth, as well as a cost component. So by 2025, there'll be a number of cities in the United States where you can get a gig cheaper than you can get 50 megabits in other parts. So that's inherently going to drive the divide. There are a number of policies that you could use to do it. Some that have been suggested are quite bad, but some are good. But that divide will get worse. But the core divide, which we're still not focusing in this country enough on, is the fundamental adoption, which is to say about 30% of the country doesn't have a broadband connection in their house. There are a variety of different reasons for that. The network, that's less a deployment issue than it is a series of other issues.
And just digging in deeper to that, because I think people will find that fascinating. That, the world's leading economy, you have 30% of people do not have home broadband access. And can we add to that they don't have data access through 4G or 5G, or that? Do you have any data on that?
Well,
so are they internet connected? What is the percentage of the population who are not internet connected?
Well, if you ask the question that way, one could argue that it's less than 5% is not connected. Because
okay, so how would you ask?
If you add mobile phones, and then you add also at work,
Yeah.
you get pretty high
Okay.
levels of connectivity.
Okay.
The question is, do you need it in the homes? Or
Yeah.
also, what's the form factor of the device? You can do various things on the phone. You can't really do your
Sure.
homework on the phone.
Absolutely.
You can't really do a resume and do other kinds of work
Yeah.
on a phone. So there's a lot of distinctions in that. But I would argue that we ought to, as a society, I mean, the core thing is that bandwidth should never be a constraint on economic growth or social progress. For that to be true, we need it in everybody's home.
Got it. Okay. So where do you think we're going to be in 5 years' time in terms of digital access as we move forward with more and more form factors, as you mentioned, as we embrace the 5G generation? We may even be towards 6G by that point. Where are we going to be at? So you implied the divide is going to get greater and broader. I assume that also means lack of access for those who are left behind.
Well, the divide is going to get greater, but that does not mean an increase in lack of access,
Fine.
right?
So how would you define
And in fact, I think the access problem in a way is going to be solved by a new generation of low Earth orbiting satellites. 5G is meaningful, though I think it's less meaningful than other people think, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah.
But there's also some kinds of fixed wireless solutions coming on board that I think the access problem per se, we're going to be in better shape. It's just that the divide will be bigger between those in the dense urban wealthy areas and those in other areas. But, tell me who wins the election and I'll make a different forecast.
Blair, do you see any, internationally, any countries which you'd call sort of best practice exemplars who've overcome, maybe like a Kenya, they've been able to skip technology generations and go from 1G to 3 to 5 or whatever you want to call it. Are there any examples there, where you've seen real best practice? Correa comes to mind as a very interesting place. Obviously some of the African nations as well. Is there anywhere that stands out as well? They've had a blank canvas and they've managed to.
Yeah, Korea stands out, but
anywhere.
But I'll just make a quick point because I think my colleagues on the panel may know more than me. What I would simply say is Korea does a fantastic job, but Korea has an advantage that 84% of the population lives in multi-dwelling units.
Sure.
Much easier to connect.
Yeah.
Very high level of density in a single big city. The reason why Korea did better, however, and this to me is the most important point about governance, which is they had a group which every year had certain metrics. They measured those. Where they fell short, they course corrected. United States, we did a national broadband plan. Where I would say we fell shortest was the implementation after our team finished our job, but we did have certain things that we had the institutions that were supposed to handle the problem. This will be critical of some of my friends, decided that they would use the plan for purposes of owning a narrative, but not in terms of owning a problem. Long, complicated story to that, but it is Korea's dedication to constantly assessing and course correcting that made it, in my opinion, that's what the best practice is, and a lot of countries don't do that.
Interesting. Ramesh, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just be super quick, and then I'll.
Yeah, and Andre can also.
So more or less, the data I've looked at show that, in a naive sense, sort of like just internet access from some ISP or even like a Google Google providing you internet access across the world, more or less that access to digital connectivity is no silver bullet. It is not emancipatory. It does not bridge these divides. It does not bridge the inequality gaps, despite what we all thought about 20 years ago, right? So we found that to be the case. I was at MIT trying to implement these projects, and we just saw them fail again and again and again on a macro level. However, what we also see is that in certain kinds of cases and places in the world, with some forms of connectivity combined with sort of a governmental and, more importantly, a local environment of entrepreneurship and know-how, all sorts of innovations can take hold. So I don't want to fetishize or put Kenya on a pedestal necessarily. There are profound inequalities. There are profound resource deprivation issues that face that country. However, there is one fiber optic cable landing point next to Mombasa and there's a Serengeti broadband network. There's only 2 major fiber optic cables connecting, by the way, the continents of Africa and South America. So that's very telling as well in terms of like the structure of infrastructure, right? And that fiber optic cable combined with sort of a cultural set of kind of like we can do it, they call it side hustle there, that's the term people use over there, combined with a government that just sort of supports people doing whatever they want, is part, and people identifying the gaps in their own lives has led to all sorts of bottom-up incredible innovations. I mean, think about M-Pesa as an example of that, right? Yeah. The banking system, these people are not seen as creditworthy. So what did? They worked around it, and now they've blown away the banking system, and now the banks are having to adapt to try to compete with Safaricom. A country like Somalia, which is plagued by huge issues, is almost completely mobile money now. So it's just examples like that that kind of open up our vocabulary and our palette for thinking about technology as something that could be bottom-up and a vehicle for developmental growth.
Andre, anything to add?
Yeah, so the positive side of looking at the issue is that to say and to believe and to hope that in the future we'll be better off. All will be better off, right? The problem with this optimistic perspective is that we know from many studies in subjective well-being and happiness that happiness, it's all relative to where others are. So that's where the problem of divide and gaps become an issue, actually, is that even though we are all better off, in relative terms, I'm still feeling behind. Some may still feel behind. I don't really think that regulation or markets will be able to solve the problem. For decades, we believed that regulations could always chasing the private sector and chasing the private developments. We believe that regulation will be able to catch up and to adjust the markets and make it all fair. I know it's not the key topic for today, but if we don't come up, if as a collective, and you alluded to that partly, to sort of a cognitive revolution of some sorts that allows our brains to create elevated sense of global awareness, I don't really trust that regulations and markets alone will be able to solve the problem. So my point is that in 50 years, or 30 or 50 or 100 years, we'll be still talking about the same divides, unless something happens in our brains that allow us to develop new forms of collaboration and to put it in a more technical language, public-private partnerships. So just one point.
Yeah.
And I always ask, why is that we don't have neuroscientists in our panels? And this is not, of course, a critique to this panel.
We have one later on, don't worry.
We have? Great, fantastic. But we should have neuroscientists in our conversation. We should have behavioral experts in our conversations. Yeah. We should have experts in communications in our panels, in our discussions. Yeah. And to your point in the previous panel, even though there are huge opportunities to break across silos, look at our university departments. Absolutely. Look at our organizations. The difficulty that it is to work across, voluntarily, I can reach out to whomever I want, at least in the US and most of the Western countries. But when it gets to formalize partnerships across departments, oh my goodness.
We'll get to let me ask you a question. There is still a market opportunity from the private sector perspective in some of these segments who are under-accessed. What can be done to incentivize key market players to go after those customers? Because these is an untapped market, to some extent. Why is it that a big telco or a big media company is not seeing that as an opportunity and thinking, can regulation push them in that direction? Is that something that could work? Okay, we're in a market economy here; we can't push too far. But could there be certain levers that push that conversation and action in that area?
I was just going to say, for all its faults, and I have a lot of criticisms of Facebook in Beyond the Valley, in my new book, is they have done a very good job on the continent of Africa, especially in like Kenya and Tanzania, at partnering with civil society groups, actually, and small-scale entrepreneurs. They realized that they had, at least over there, they realized, so there's more or less, the big tech companies kind of are starting to understand that just more people on the internet in general is just a good thing for them, because more or less people are going to migrate to WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook. Instagram is huge in Kenya and so on. So what they're trying to do is just incentivize and leverage local partners, not to access the Facebook like nonsense, non-net neutral internet, which blew up in their face, but to try to basically get people access and to basically fund local initiatives and local entrepreneurs that support connectivity. That's smart.
What about the telcos? Yeah. Why is it the telcos? Blair can talk to this.
The simple reason for the telcos is that they price not to the lowest, the incremental cost is zero, right? The fundamental economics of the telco business is high capital cost, close to zero incremental cost, but therefore they're pricing to profit maximize, as well they should, rather than to serve the maximum number of people. So roughly speaking, they're pricing at an entry-level point to get to the 70–80%. But if they lower that anymore, they'll lose a lot of revenue from people who would be paying, instead of $30 a month, $10 a month, and they would increase the audience, but they would actually make less money. So that's the.
But that differs in countries where the state owns a golden share in its telecoms companies, or does it not? So whether it be France Telecom or China Mobile, etc., however active or inactive the state is meant to be, surely there's an element of social mission there.
Well, state ownership of telcos, that in most countries, that's no longer true. I mean, it certainly is true, and there are some who have a large stake, but they're no longer the controlling party in the same way. Yeah. And so that's different than kind of the post office, which is supposed to serve this broader public purpose. So I think that's a fundamental problem. There are a variety of different ways one can address it. In the United States, we address it in the public realm with a program called Lifeline. There are certain companies like Comcast that have programs designed to address it. But there are still significant obstacles.
Got it. Just tying up here, we've got a few minutes just to tie up the panel. Any quick lasting thoughts on this? Doesn't sound like we've hit the most optimistic note here as to where we're going. There are elements of optimism in the developing world, if you like, but in terms of the developed West, it doesn't seem that we're moving in the right direction in terms of inclusivity, access, and general, if you like, information, what we call information dominance, and all the impacts of that. Just a few comments each, if you could.
There are examples of local types of innovation emerging in ways that I described from around the world, here in the United States as well. Native communities have built their own mesh networks and intranets, right, rather than internet. So the local networks that support the growth of business ecosystems, but also more importantly, educational and cultural kinds of systems. Detroit has a community technology project that was like profiled by Vice, by Motherboard on Vice, that got a lot of attention. It's very similar to the same sorts of implementations you see in Zenzaleni in South Africa, in Argentina, in Guifinet in Catalonia, in Rizomatica and Oaxaca. These are all examples that I give in the book. So these initiatives can scale because it is actually potentially legal to build your own community network in this country. I'm not saying that's the solution, but that's one model of localizing that I speak about.
Blair, any thoughts on that?
I would actually be more optimistic, but I think it's happening at a lot of different local levels, and eventually that which we thought would happen really quickly will emerge, which is simply by eliminating the distribution costs, we will deliver better education to more people, we will deliver better healthcare to more people. But that would require a certain kind of change in the paradigm of how we think about the role of government interacting with technology.
Andre, a quick word.
Yeah, so we all feel the urgency of change within our own generations. If it's past 2 or 3 generations, it's already an eternity. So I rely my optimism on a longitudinal understanding of history. And look where we are compared we were in the past not long ago. So that's my first closing note in terms of optimism. And to a very large extent, we are all learning. And I think we need to embrace that humbly. We are all learning how to navigate the post-industrial revolution world. And I'm not crazy when I say post-revolution, industrial revolution. It's still a very recent experience. At a more local level, I always like to give the example of the 300+ U.S. mayors that came up and stood up when Washington decided to step down of the Paris Agreement to emphasize and to publicly announce that they would commit and they would honor the U.S. commitment towards the Paris Agreement. So this is just one symbolic example, practical example actually, of how at the local level things are really happening.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you so much. We have plenty of questions, but we don't have time. So thank you so much to the panelists. A quick round of applause, and we will look forward to seeing that online. Thank you. We're on to the next panel right away.